think about the operating system on the device you're using to listen to this right now.
Right.
It is running silently in the background, dictating how every single app functions, how the memory is allocated, how your battery drains.
Yeah, making thousands of decisions a second.
Exactly. And when you buy a new device, you don't really question that underlying architecture. You just assume, well, this is how a computer naturally works. The operating system is just the default reality.
You never see the code, you just live in the interface.
Yes, you just live in the interface, and that is the perfect lens for what we are doing today. Welcome to today's deep dive. Today is Wednesday, July 29, 2026. And we're embarking on a mission to deconstruct the source code of human society itself.
Which is a massive undertaking.
It really is. We are digging into this incredibly comprehensive body of historical and anthropological research regarding the origins and the evolution of patriarchy. And I'm just going to lay it out there for you listening. The research outlines what might literally be the single biggest plot twist in the entire story of our species.
It is a genuinely paradigm-shifting area of study. I mean, when you actually look at the archaeological data, the entire foundation of how we just assume humans are meant to live starts to crack.
Because the mission today is to look at the operating system of our modern world. I'm talking about male-dominated hierarchies, and specifically that isolated nuclear family unit.
Right, the classic model.
You know the one. A husband, a wife, their kids in a single household. We are constantly told from every possible direction that this is the traditional default.
That it's the natural order of things.
Exactly. We're told it's just biology working as intended. But the central thesis of this historical record drops this massive truth bomb. For 95% to 98% of human history, the actual natural order was fiercely, almost violently egalitarian.
Which completely upends the conventional narrative we've all been fed.
Totally flips it.
And the stakes here, for you as the listener, they're incredibly high. Our goal today isn't just to, rattle off a timeline of ancient dates and dusty artifacts and dead kings.
Nobody wants that.
No. We are here to understand the mechanics of the why. We need to connect the dots between these massive shifts in ancient technology, the invention of private wealth, and the fundamental rewiring of human social networks, kinship structures, and eventually the law itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to examine exactly how that original egalitarian human operating system was erased, why women were suddenly and systematically subjugated, and how this led directly to the creation of the isolated domestic unit.
Right.
But hold on, I have to stop you right there. Before we even get into the timeline, I have a major point of skepticism.
Lay it on me.
Because if I turn on a nature documentary right now and I watch chimpanzees, which are our closest genetic relatives, I see incredibly violent male-dominated hierarchies.
You do.
Alpha males fighting for control, hoarding resources, dominating the females. If that is our evolutionary family tree, aren't we just biologically wired for patriarchy? I mean, how can anyone claim that our natural baseline is egalitarian?
It's a very common pushback, and it's one that biological determinists love to use. But it completely misreads evolutionary anthropology.
Okay, how so?
Well, yes, chimpanzees have strict male hierarchies. But if you look at bonobos,
Oh, right.
yeah, they share the exact same amount of DNA with us as chimpanzees do. And their societies are female-dominated, highly peaceful, and they use social bonding to resolve conflict rather than violence.
Yeah.
We sit squarely between those two behavioral models.
So we aren't just locked into the chimpanzee model.
Not at all. What makes Homo sapiens unique is our behavioral plasticity. Our social structures are dictated by our ecological environment and our survival strategies, not some rigid genetic script.
Right.
And for the vast, overwhelming majority of the human timeline, we're talking roughly 300,000 years ago, all the way up to about 12,000 years before present. The Paleolithic era, our survival strategy, absolutely demanded equality.
Because humans lived as mobile hunter-gatherers then.
Exactly. And the most crucial thing to understand about these early societies is that they lacked centralized authority. There were no standing armies. There was no private real estate.
Because you can't own a piece of the forest if you literally have to follow the reindeer herd every season.
You just can't. And because there was no accumulated static wealth, it was functionally impossible for any single group or any single gender to establish structural dominance over the rest.
You couldn't hoard resources to leverage power over someone else.
Exactly.
Okay, but this immediately clashes with another very stubborn image we all have in our heads. Forget the chimpanzees for a second. Think about the classic textbook image of the caveman.
Oh, the man-the-hunter diorama.
Yes, the man-the-hunter diorama in the Natural History Museum. The strong, aggressive male going out with the spear, taking down a woolly mammoth, and bringing home the bacon to his dependent wife who is just, sitting passively in the cave tending a fire. The research attacks this head-on, right?
It dismantles it completely. That man-the-hunter narrative is largely a myth.
A total...
Yeah, it's a fiction constructed by 19th century science. What you have to realize is that the foundational Victorian anthropologists, they were looking at the ancient world, but they were wearing highly tinted Victorian glasses.
Oh, that makes sense.
They lived in an era of hyper-patriarchal, industrialized social structures. Men went to the factory and women stayed in the parlor. So when they dug up ancient human remains, they simply projected their own reality backward in time.
They saw exactly what they expected to see. Like, if they found a skeleton buried with a hunting tool, they just assumed, without even checking, that it was a male skeleton.
Yes. They literally just assume. But when modern science actually looks at the data using bioarchaeology, DNA analysis, isotopic testing, a completely different picture emerges.
Right.
In these non-hierarchical foraging societies, particularly in temperate and tropical zones, women were the primary economic drivers of the community. They weren't just sitting in caves.
They were out there.
They were out gathering plant materials, nuts, roots, and hunting small game. And this gathered food, it accounted for 60% to 80% of the daily caloric intake of the entire band.
Wait, 60 to 80%? That is massive.
It's the vast majority of the diet.
That completely flips the script from dependent wife to primary breadwinner, or I guess primary root winner.
It really does. I mean, think about the mechanics of hunting large game. It is a high-risk, high-reward endeavor. It's essentially an unpredictable caloric jackpot.
Because you could miss.
Exactly. A group of hunters might take down a large animal, which provides this massive influx of protein.
Yeah.
But they also might come back completely empty-handed for a week or more.
And you cannot survive on that unpredictability alone.
No, the group would starve. The gathering and small game hunting done by women provided the reliable daily baseline of energy that actually kept the group alive from day to day. They were the primary producers.
Wow.
And because they held that primary economic role, they held substantial economic leverage and social power.
Which brings us to the structure of the family itself during this time. We really need to talk about the terms matrilocal and bilateral kinship.
This is a foundational concept if you want to understand how humans actually lived for 95% of our history. In many of these foraging bands, residence was matrilocal.
Which means what exactly?
It means when a couple paired off, they didn't go buy a new cave just for the two of them.
Right. They didn't move to the suburbs.
No. The male partner moved to live near or with the woman's extended family. Or the arrangement was bilateral or multilocal, meaning the living arrangements were highly flexible and group-oriented. They ebbed and flowed based on the seasons and the group's needs.
Rather than being permanently centered around a single dominant male head of household.
Exactly.
I really want to pause and emphasize this for you listening, because the isolated, independent nuclear family unit, a husband, a wife, and their kids, living in their own private house with a white picket fence, completely separated from their extended family. We are conditioned from birth to think of that as the traditional default.
We really are.
We just assume it's the biological norm for human reproduction and child rearing. But what the data shows is that the nuclear family wasn't the natural order at all. It's actually a bizarre anomaly.
It is a vastly later invention, and as we will explore, a highly engineered and oppressive one. The true natural order was extended, overlapping networks of kin. And this matters immensely when we talk about power dynamics, safety, and domestic pathology.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of that. Why is a matrilocal network so much safer than a nuclear family?
Well, think about the physical reality of a matrilocal living arrangement. If a woman is living alongside her mother, her sisters, her aunts, and her female cousins, she possesses a robust, built-in physical and social network.
A safety net.
Exactly. So if a male partner gets angry and attempts to use physical coercion or domestic abuse, he isn't just dealing with an isolated, dependent wife behind closed doors.
Right.
He is instantly answering to an entire unified collective of her extended family who are sitting right next to her at the fire. This kinship structure naturally and inherently deterred domestic violence.
Because the consequences were immediate. You can't bully someone when they are surrounded by their entire support system.
You'd be outnumbered immediately.
It's a structure of built-in safety. Mutual interdependence was the ultimate survival strategy, and that interdependence provided an inescapable physical shield.
Precisely. In a nomadic band, Alienating the group through violent behavior means you risk being cast out. And being cast out of a hunter-gatherer band is essentially a death sentence.
So the environment naturally punished coercive, dominating behavior.
It did.
Okay, I love the logic of this, but I know some people listening might be thinking, this sounds like a nice utopian theory about peaceful gatherers. But how do we actually know this? Where is the hard proof that things were this equal?
Which is a fair question.
And this is where the archaeological record absolutely shines. Let's talk about Çatalhöyük.
Yes, Çatalhöyük is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world for understanding this transition. It's an ancient proto-urban settlement located in central Anatolia in modern-day Turkey.
And we are looking at an occupation period from roughly 7,500 to 5,700 BCE, right?
That's the window, yeah.
So this is right at the tail end of the true egalitarian era, as humans were just beginning to experiment with early, dense settlements, but before full-blown agriculture and states took over. And the layout of this city is mind-blowing.
It's incredible.
It didn't have streets. The houses were built completely flush against each other like a honeycomb. People walked across the roofs and entered their homes through a hole in the ceiling using a ladder.
The architecture itself reflects a deeply communal mindset. But what archaeologists found inside those houses, and more specifically beneath the floors of those houses, is what provides our hard evidence for radical equality.
Right, because they analyzed the bone isotopes of the skeletons found buried there. Now, for anyone unfamiliar, bone isotopes are incredible because they act like a chemical diary of what a person ate over their entire lifetime.
They're amazing.
You can look at the carbon and nitrogen signatures and know exactly what their diet consisted of.
And the isotopic analysis at Çatalhöyük proves definitively that men and women were eating the exact same diet.
Wow.
There was no caloric favoritism. Often, in hierarchical or patriarchal societies, you see men consuming significantly more protein or higher quality cuts of meat, while women subsist on lower quality grains.
But that was absolutely absent here.
Completely absent.
Furthermore, they did an analysis of the bone density and joint wear. When you do repetitive physical labor, your bones actually adapt and change shape to handle the stress.
Right.
The skeletons at Çatalhöyük showed that men and women were performing very similar levels of physical labor. Women were relegated to light, indoor tasks while men did all the heavy lifting. The labor was shared.
And perhaps most tellingly, we look at how they treated their dead. As you mentioned, at Çatalhöyük, the dead were buried beneath the floors of the houses. When archaeologists excavated these sites across the settlement, they found that men and women were buried in the exact same manner.
Oh, that's a huge indicator.
They were placed in the same positions, and they were buried with the exact same types of grave goods.
And grave goods are the ultimate indicator of status, right? If you find a guy buried with a golden crown and 10 swords, and a woman buried with nothing, you know who held the power.
Exactly. But at Çatalhöyük, there was absolutely zero evidence of gendered social stratification. There was no chief's palace, no elite male graveyard, and no distinction in how male and female lives were valued in death.
So the physical evidence from their diet, their labor, and their burials points to a society that practiced absolute structural equality.
It is the ultimate proof of an egalitarian society.
I like to think of this 95% of human history, these Paleolithic bands and early settlements, like an early stage startup.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
If you've ever worked at a startup out of a garage, you know exactly what the culture is like. Everyone is doing everything.
Yeah.
The CEO is taking out the trash. The lead developer is answering customer service emails.
Right. There is no strict corporate hierarchy.
No corner offices. No exclusive executive washrooms. Why? Because there is no accumulated capital yet. You are just trying to survive the quarter. Everyone holds equal equity in the endeavor because the harsh environment demands complete mutual collaboration.
You can't have a rigid hierarchy when you are completely nomadic, and everything you own has to be carried on your back. The lack of surplus prevents the formation of permanent power structures. You can't have a ruling class if there is nothing to rule over other than the immediate daily struggle for calories.
Okay, so this brings us to the massive turning point. If the natural order, the default human operating system, was this fiercely egalitarian, mutually dependent, matrilocal startup, what broke it?
That's the big question.
How on earth did we go from sharing the calories on the roof of a house in Anatolia to a world of absolute, legally codified male dominance?
To answer that, we have to look at the early agriculture transition, often called the Neolithic Revolution. We are moving roughly into the window between 10,000 and 4,000 BCE, and the catalyst that broke the egalitarian system was, quite simply, the invention of wealth.
The moment we stopped chasing our food across the plains and started growing it in the dirt.
Yes. Historians and economic anthropologists, figures like Gerda Lerner, Friedrich Engels, and Esther Boserup, have tracked this transition meticulously. They point to a confluence of factors that began with sedentism.
And sedentism just means staying in one place permanently.
Right. This was coupled with the domestication of plants and animals.
I want to break down the mechanics of this because it's not immediately obvious to a modern listener. How does simply staying in one place and planting wheat create wealth? We think of wealth as money or gold.
Sure. Well, in a nomadic foraging band, if a hunter kills a massive mammoth, or if the women gather a colossal pile of berries, they cannot hoard it.
Right. The meat will rot in a matter of days.
The berries will spoil, and even if they didn't, the food would simply be too heavy to carry when the band inevitably has to migrate to their winter grounds. You are forced by the laws of physics and biology to either consume it immediately or share it with the group to build social capital.
But when you settle down...
Yes. When you clear a permanent plot of land and domesticate grain, like wheat or barley, the rules of reality change.
Right.
You can build a clay silo. You can harvest grain and store it for 2, 3, or even 5 years.
Wow.
When you domesticate sheep or cattle, they breed. Your food supply compounds like interest in a bank account. For the very first time in human history, humans created a tangible, long-term food surplus.
And a surplus is capital. It's the first time you can actually look at your neighbor and definitively have more than them. You can have 3 silos of grain and they might only have 1.
Exactly. Land plots and herds of livestock represented accumulated capital. The concept of private property was born. And this accumulated capital completely shattered the early-stage startup dynamic.
Because now you aren't just surviving day to day, you have an estate, you have assets.
You do.
Here's where it gets deeply fascinating and honestly incredibly dark. Because once you invent wealth, a completely new biological problem emerges. A problem that Paleolithic humans never, ever had to worry about. The historical research calls it the paternity concern.
This is the absolute crux of the paradigm shift, the pivot point of human history. If you are a male head of household in this new agricultural world, and you have spent your entire life breaking your back to accumulate this unprecedented wealth, this fertile land, these massive herds of cattle, you naturally want to pass it down to your genetic offspring when you die.
You want to keep the wealth in your lineage.
Exactly.
But there is a massive biological bottleneck here, isn't there? A woman always knows with absolute 100% certainty who her children are. She physically gives birth to them. There is zero doubt.
Right.
A man, however, prior to modern DNA testing, could never be entirely certain that a child was biologically his.
He couldn't. Unless he could absolutely guarantee that his partner had not been sexually intimate with anyone else.
And that biological reality created a massive social pathology. Because to verify paternity and therefore guarantee that his hard-won property was passed exclusively to his rightful heirs, the male property owner had to exert absolute control over female sexuality.
This is where we see the structural subjugation of women begin in earnest. And it is crucial to note, this didn't happen out of some innate biological hatred or sudden maliciousness. It happened as an economic imperative.
The enforcement of strict monogamy for wives became an economic necessity for property transmission.
Yes.
But to enforce that monogamy, you can't just ask nicely. Men essentially had to isolate women. They had to physically pull them out of those robust matrilocal support networks, the networks that protected them from abuse, and place them into walled gardens.
This is the birth of the isolated domestic unit.
The nuclear family was invented as a containment strategy.
It was. By isolating a woman in a single-family dwelling, removed from her brothers and sisters, the male head of household could monitor her movements, control her social interactions, and guarantee his paternity.
I want to give you an analogy that might make the sheer mechanics of this easier to grasp. Think about digital media today. If a major studio spends $200 million making a blockbuster movie, they want to make sure only paying customers can watch it.
Right. They don't want people copying it and giving it away for free.
Exactly.
Amen.
So they invent DRM, digital rights management. It's a digital lock, a piece of encrypted code that prevents you from copying or sharing the file. What the anthropological record is describing here is the invention of a DRM lock for human biology.
A biological DRM. That is a chilling but highly accurate way to frame it.
The only way a male property owner in the Neolithic era could guarantee the product his genetic offspring was entirely his was by locking the woman in an isolated, highly controlled domestic environment.
Right.
The nuclear family structure wasn't created because it was the most emotionally fulfilling or biologically natural way to live. It was created as a biological lockbox to protect male wealth. And to make that lockbox secure, you had to strip away her ancestral matrilocal support network. You have to make her entirely dependent on you.
And what makes this transition so devastating is that this social isolation was compounded by a massive technological shift occurring at the exact same time.
Yeah.
We need to introduce the groundbreaking research of economist Esther Boserup regarding the transition from hoe agriculture to plow agriculture.
Because early farming wasn't all heavy plows and oxen. I think we tend to picture medieval farming when we think of ancient agriculture.
Right, we picture the big wooden plows. Early agriculture is known as horticulture. It relied on the hoe and the digging stick. And Boserup's research established that this early hoe agriculture actually relied very heavily on women's labor.
Interesting.
Yeah, women were still out in the fields producing calories, much like they were when they were gathering in the Paleolithic era. They retained a degree of economic importance. But then, as populations grew and soils depleted, humans had to farm more difficult, heavy clay soils. To do this, they invented the heavy animal-drawn plow.
And the biomechanics of this tool change everything about who is producing the calories.
Radically. Operating a heavy plow is not like using a hoe. Constantly wrestling a massive wooden plow into the hard earth, trying to keep it straight, while simultaneously managing a massive, often uncooperative draft animal like an ox. It required intense, sustained upper body strength.
Right?
It also required leaving the immediate vicinity of the home for long hours. This specific technological requirement physically moved the primary economic production out of the hands of women and out of the domestic sphere, placing it firmly into male hands.
So women literally lose their primary economic leverage overnight because of a tool.
They do. And simultaneously, another biological trap springs shut. The shift to a carbohydrate-rich agricultural diet, eating tons of wheat and porridge, combined with the fact that they were no longer walking 10 miles a day, caused female body fat percentages to rise.
Which impacts fertility.
Exactly. This, coupled with sedentism, caused birth rates to absolutely spike. In nomadic societies, women spaced out births significantly, often by 3 or 4 years, because carrying multiple infants on the move while foraging was physically impossible.
You literally couldn't carry them all.
Right. But in settled farming communities, the time between births dropped drastically.
So if we look at the whole picture, women were pushed out of primary economic production by the physical demands of the plow, and at the exact same time, they were permanently anchored to the domestic sphere by a massive increase in child-rearing and domestic duties.
The walled garden was complete.
It was a perfect storm of economic, technological, and biological factors. The invention of private property created the desire to control female reproduction. The invention of the plow removed female economic independence, and the agricultural diet trapped them in continuous cycles of pregnancy.
The natural egalitarian order was completely and systematically dismantled.
But the creation of wealth didn't just alter the micro level of the family. If we zoom out, it changed human relations on a macro scale, altering how entire communities interacted with one another. Because the moment you build that grain silo we talked about, you paint a massive target on your back.
Exactly. Once you have communities with stored grain silos and corrals full of valuable livestock, you have created something worth stealing.
Right.
Imagine a neighboring group that relies on foraging, or perhaps a farming village that just suffered a devastating drought or a locust swarm. They are facing starvation. They look over the hill and see your village with a surplus of grain and fat cattle.
They now have a very clear, desperate incentive to come and take your surplus by force.
Yes, and this grim reality caused intercommunity warfare to escalate dramatically.
So to protect the wealth, you need guards, you need a military.
Settled villages had to develop specialized, male-dominated military elites. You see the rise of the warrior class? Men whose entire social and economic value was tied to their ability to inflict violence and protect the community's property.
Which just gives them more power.
Absolutely. This further entrenched male dominance, as power naturally centralized around those who controlled the physical means of violence. The men with the spears made the rules.
But the historical record highlights a devastating point here about what these early wars were actually fought over. It wasn't just about stealing grain or cattle. It was about stealing people. Specifically, women.
This is perhaps one of the most tragic and consequential turning points in human psychology. During these early raids and conflicts, women captured from rival communities became the first enslaved people.
I really need you to hear this point because it shifts everything. This wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of a skirmish over a wheat field. This was a foundational shift in how human beings perceived one another. The capture of these women was the exact moment in history where the concept was born that a female body could be owned, traded, and controlled as literal property.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the Neolithic Revolution, you see the chilling progression of commodification. First, humans commodified the land, drawing borders, putting up fences and saying, "This earth is mine." Then they commodified animals, penning them in, selectively breeding them, and extracting their labor for wealth. And the dark, inevitable next step in that logical chain was commodifying human beings.
But why capture women instead of men?
Because captured enemy warriors are highly dangerous and likely to rebel or kill you in your sleep. Captured women, separated from their kin and often burdened with children, are easier to control.
That makes a horrific sort of sense.
They could be used for forced agricultural labor, domestic servitude, and, most brutally, forced reproduction to increase the owning family's workforce.
It's the ultimate expansion of the biological DRM we talked about earlier. Not only do you lock up the women in your own community to guarantee your paternity, but you actively raid and steal women from other communities to increase your labor force and your wealth.
Right.
The female body is reduced to a resource no different than a field of barley or a herd of sheep.
Capturing foreign women normalized the idea that female autonomy was entirely subject to male ownership. And once that concept takes root in the human operating system, it creates a cascading effect.
It spreads.
Yes, as these early agricultural settlements grew into massive, complex cities and eventually into the first great empires, they needed more than just informal violence or a warrior's threat to maintain this unequal system. They needed bureaucracy.
Which brings us from the realm of informal male bias directly into the cold, hard institutionalization of oppression. We are moving forward in time now into the period roughly between 3000 and 1000 BCE, the era of law and the state.
We're looking at the birth of the first great state bureaucracies in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and later China. When a city reaches a population of tens of thousands, you can't just rely on local village customs, you need written laws.
You need code.
And what we see in the historical record is that the informal subjugation of women we've been discussing was formally, meticulously, and legally institutionalized. State law officially converted women into the legal dependents of their fathers or their husbands.
Let's get into the granular details of this. How did they actually enforce this on clay tablets and papyrus? The historical record points us to a perfect case study. Hammurabi's Code from Babylon, roughly 1750 BCE.
King Hammurabi's legal code is incredibly famous. If you took a world history class, you probably heard it lauded as an early triumph of justice, the birthplace of an eye for an eye, and the foundation of the rule of law.
That's how it's always taught.
But when you read the actual statutes through the lens of gender dynamics and property rights, it reads entirely differently. It represents one of the clearest, most detailed historical documents illustrating a fully established, institutionalized patriarchy.
It is the patriarchal operating system written out in black and white legal code. Let's look at how marriage functioned under Hammurabi. We have to strip away all our modern notions of romance or soulmates. Marriage was explicitly structured as a literal business contract between the groom and the bride's father.
It was quite literally a transfer of property from one male head of household to another. Dowries and bride prices were exchanged, signifying the wealth moving between the men.
So the woman herself had no independent economic status.
None. She could not sign contracts in her own right. Her entire financial and legal existence was subsumed under her male guardians.
But the most shocking part of Hammurabi's code, and what really exposes the underlying goal of these laws, is the absolute asymmetry in sexual crimes. Let me read you the hypocrisy here. Under the code, if a wife was caught committing adultery, the punishment was death.
Death.
She and her lover were to be bound together and thrown into the river to drown, unless her husband, her legal owner, chose to graciously spare her life.
But conversely, the code placed no such restrictions on a married man. A husband could freely access concubines, enslaved women, or prostitutes without facing any legal sanction whatsoever. His extramarital activities were not considered a crime against his wife.
This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the law had absolutely nothing to do with moral purity, religious sanctity, or the emotional sanctity of marriage.
Nothing at all.
If it were about morality, the punishment would be equal for both parties. The law was exclusively about protecting that biological DRM. A wife's adultery threatened the male lineage. It introduced the risk of another man's child inheriting the hard-won estate. A husband's infidelity did not threaten his own lineage or his property, so the state simply didn't care.
The law was designed from the ground up to protect male capital, not to enforce a universal moral standard. And the concept of women as pure capital, as liquid assets, is further demonstrated by the horrific laws surrounding debt.
Oh, this part is wild.
Hammurabi's code actually stipulated that a male head of household who was experiencing financial hardship, say he had a bad harvest or a flood wiped out his crops, or he just made bad trades he could legally sell or pledge his wife, his sons, or his daughters into indentured debt servitude for up to 3 years to cover his bad debts to a creditor.
He could literally hand his wife over to the local loan shark to work off his credit card bill. It is horrifying. You can trace a direct, unbroken line from the invention of private property in a wheat field to the hoarding of wealth in a silo to the creation of laws that allow a man to use his family as financial collateral. The commodification of the human being is absolute.
And this legal stratification only grew more complex, more rigid, and more visually codified over time.
Yeah.
If we move forward several centuries after Hammurabi, we arrive at the Middle Assyrian Laws, which date to around 875 BCE.
This is where we see the introduction of compulsory veiling. And this absolutely blew my mind because the historical context here completely reframes how we typically view this practice.
The Middle Assyrian laws are incredibly specific. They mandated that respectable married women, meaning women who were firmly under the legal protection, ownership, and sexual control of a male citizen, or widows who had previously been under such control, were legally required to wear a veil when they went out in public.
Right.
However, the law explicitly forbade enslaved women, prostitutes, and unmarried lower-class women from wearing veils.
And the punishment for an enslaved woman or a prostitute caught wearing a veil in public was severe physical mutilation. We were talking about being publicly flogged with 50 stripes, having pitch poured on her head, or having her ears violently cut off. Why such a brutally psychotic punishment for wearing an item of clothing?
Because in this era, the veil was not primarily about religious modesty or piety. It was a state-monitored property tag.
The property tag.
Yes, it was a visual codification of social class and male ownership. By mandating the veil for married women and violently forbidding it for others, the state created a stark, immediate visual division in the public sphere.
It instantly communicated a message to every man on the street.
Exactly. It communicated who was a respectable woman, meaning protected private property, that other men could not touch without facing severe legal and financial consequences from her husband, and who was an unprotected woman, meaning public property or enslaved property, that was open to sexual exploitation and harassment without legal repercussion.
It is so chillingly calculated. It turns the female body into a walking billboard advertising her legal status and who owns her to the men around her. So by 1000 BCE, you have this incredibly rigid, violent, legally enforced patriarchal system. Women are stripped of economic power by the plow, isolated in domestic units to guarantee paternity, traded as property in marriage contracts, used as collateral for debt, and visually tagged by the state.
But if you are the ruling class, you run into a massive structural problem here.
What's that?
You cannot force an entire population to accept a fundamentally oppressive, unnatural legal order purely through the threat of violence and state bureaucracy forever. A system maintained solely by the sword is fragile. Eventually, people will recognize the injustice and they will rebel.
Right. If everyone knows the system is rigged for the benefit of a few male property owners, the system eventually collapses under the weight of its own hypocrisy.
Exactly. To ensure long-term, multi-generational stability, you have to convince the subjugated population that this hierarchy isn't just a man-made law drafted by greedy kings.
You have to convince them it is the divine, inescapable order of the universe.
Right. You have to rewrite reality itself.
Which brings us to the psychological software update, religion and ideology. To install the new patriarchal operating system permanently, you have to overwrite the foundational myths of humanity.
We see this massive theological transformation clearly documented in the historical and mythological record. If you look at early agricultural societies, before the institutionalization of the patriarchal state, their religions heavily featured prominent, supreme female creation deities.
Like who?
You have powerful goddesses like Inanna or Ishtar in early Mesopotamia, Ninhursag or Namu. These were primordial forces associated with the earth, agriculture, fertility, and the origin of life itself.
Which makes perfect logical sense for early people. It reflects the biological reality they understood. Life physically comes from the female body. The earth produces the harvest. The divine feminine was the obvious, intuitive source of creation.
Yeah, but as the political institutions became rigidly patriarchal, the PR department for the new state had to change the narrative. They had to dethrone the mother goddess.
And they did so quite literally in their mythologies. Anthropologists point to a distinct period of mythological revisionism. Over time, the ancient narratives were systematically rewritten to feature supreme aggressive male storm or warrior gods, violently defeating, subduing, and replacing those older female primordial forces.
The ultimate bloodiest example of this is the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish.
Yes. In this epic, you have Tiamat, the ancient female dragon goddess of the primordial ocean and chaos. She represents the old world order, and she is brutally slain by a young, upstart male warrior god named Maruk.
And the way he kills her is incredibly symbolic. He doesn't just defeat her, he shoots an arrow down her throat, splitting her body completely in half. And from the two halves of her mutilated female body, he creates the heavens and the earth.
It is a mythological representation of a hostile political takeover. It is the male warrior class violently destroying the old matriarchal, earth-centered worldview to build the new patriarchal state quite literally on top of its ruins.
It served as a divine justification for the new social order. The theological message was clear: female energy is chaos, and male dominance is what brings order and civilization. Furthermore, we see a fundamental, insidious shift in how the origin of life itself was conceptualized.
Yes, this is so subtle but so profound. In the older oral traditions, life sprang naturally and physically from female fertility, from the womb of the earth goddess. But in the later codified patriarchal traditions, the creation of the world and of humanity is attributed solely to divine male action.
Usually through male speech, breath, or intellect. The male creator god speaks the world into existence. The word becomes the source of life. This intentionally prioritizes male intellect, rationality, and spirit over female biology, nature, and matter.
It's mind over matter, male over female. And in these new mythologies, female life is almost always framed as a secondary creation, an afterthought, made from the rib of a man, for instance.
Yes.
Or worse, the female figure is depicted as the source of a moral falling. The woman is the one who opens the box or eats the fruit, bringing sin, chaos, and death into the perfectly ordered male creation.
It is a brilliant, albeit devastating ideological campaign. By changing the origin story, you change how people perceive their own innate worth and their place in the hierarchy. You convince women that their subjugation is a divine punishment or a natural necessity.
And this ideological campaign didn't stop with religion. As societies advanced, it eventually needed a stamp of approval from the intellectuals. It needed to be proven by science and philosophy. Which brings us to classical Greece, around the 4th century BCE, and a man whose ideas would dominate Western thought for 2 millennia, the philosopher Aristotle.
Aristotle provided the ultimate secular rationalization for patriarchal dominance. He essentially codified the subjugation of women into early scientific and biological theory.
He explicitly claimed that women were biologically incomplete males.
That was his exact framing. In his biological treatises, he argued that during reproduction, the male semen provided the form, the active principle, and the soul of the child. The female body merely provided the passive, inert matter.
So he viewed them as just vessels.
Basically, because he believed women were essentially defective men lacking vital heat, he argued they possessed inferior rational and moral capacities compared to men. And because their rational capacities were deemed biologically deficient, Aristotle argued it was entirely natural, just, and necessary for women to be under the permanent tutelage and control of male citizens.
It is the perfect, inescapable, closed loop. The state creates a system that violently strips women of their economic power, denies them access to education, forces them into domestic isolation, and legally subjugates them. And then the philosophers look at these subjugated, uneducated, isolated women and say, look at them, they are clearly inferior, they don't write philosophy or lead armies. Our laws are just reflecting biology.
They use the damage they cause as proof that the system was justified.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy masquerading as natural law. And with the widespread adoption of Aristotelian philosophy, the erasure of the egalitarian natural order was complete. The patriarchal operating system was fully installed, justified by religion, enforced by the state apparatus, and rationalized by science.
Exactly.
Wow, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. I want to talk directly to you, the listener, and just summarize this profound journey we've been on. Because the core revelation here should completely change how you view the world around you, and especially how you view the concept of tradition.
It really reframes everything.
It does. The isolated, male-dominated domestic unit, the nuclear family where the man is the head of the household and women are subordinate, is not the natural human order. We lived for hundreds of thousands of years in highly egalitarian, mutually dependent, extended networks where women were primary economic producers and were protected from coercion.
That was the baseline.
Patriarchy is a manufactured structure. It is a patch applied to our social code. It was born from the invention of private property and the biomechanical demands of the heavy plow. It was driven by the obsessive economic need to verify paternity to protect accumulated wealth. It was enforced by violent state laws that commodified the female body as a resource, and it was justified by rewritten mythologies and flawed philosophies that convinced us all it was just biology.
And that is the true, enduring value of deep historical and anthropological analysis. By understanding the mechanical origins of these systems, we develop essential critical thinking. When we recognize that patriarchy is a constructed socio-economic system rather than a biological destiny or a divine mandate, we regain our agency.
Which is so empowering.
It is. What was constructed by human choices, human laws, and ancient technologies can be deconstructed by human choices. We reclaim the cognitive power to imagine and build entirely different, more equitable social structures.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week. The historical record makes it very clear that the transition to patriarchy was largely driven by a specific technological shift, the heavy animal-drawn plow, a tool that required intense upper body strength and physically moved economic production out of the home and into male hands.
Right.
But look at the world today. Look at the device you are listening to this on. Our primary economic tools are no longer plows and swords. They are digital. Keyboards, screens, algorithms, AI. These tools require absolutely zero upper body physical strength to operate. And furthermore, the rise of remote work and digital nomadism is aggressively moving primary economic production back into the home space, breaking down the artificial divide between the domestic and the economic spheres.
That is an amazing point.
If ancient technological shifts created the patriarchal structure by altering the means of production, is it possible that our current technological revolution is inherently designed to dismantle it? Are we, right now, writing the code for a new, egalitarian operating system without even realizing it? Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive. Next time you look at the structure of society, remember it's not the hardware, it's just an operating system. And systems can always be upgraded.